Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on the basics of using the Nessus vulnerability scanner. In this video we'll cover some of the things that you need to know about the Nessus vulnerability scanner to get up and running, such as where to download it and how to log into it and select policies, create scan templates, and look at the reports. We'll then dive into some more specific topics and talk about discovery scans, or what I like to call asset discovery scans, and how to configure Nessus to do that, performing a basic vulnerability scan across your network, adding credentials into your vulnerability scans and doing patch auditing and showing some of the other things that Nessus can do once it has credentials on a host. Another example of scanning with credentials is configuration auditing, where Nessus logs into the system using the provided credentials, then audits the configuration according to templates that you download and upload into the Nessus policy. An example of one of those is sensitive data discovery and Nessus looking for social security number and credit cards. Web application testing is a whole other area within Nessus where Nessus can look at your web applications, and there's some specific configuration which we'll cover so that you can be more effective doing that. We'll cover some reporting and filtering, how to dive into a report, filter on some results, and export them into the various formats. And then finally we'll cover risk analysis and compliance and show how to run a PCI compliance scan. The first thing you need to know about Nessus is where to get it. You can go to www.nessus.org and download either the home feed, or you can also, through our store, purchase the professional feed. And once you download Nessus, you will need an activation code, and right here at the top of our downloads page, it says, to use Nessus, you need this activation code. You can click here. It's a painless process, and you can register for one. You can see we support multiple operating systems to run Nessus on, including Windows, OS X, and several different Linux distributions, including, of course, we also support FreeBSD, Solaris, and we have apps for the iPhone and Android, which allow you can see they're listed as client only, allow you to talk to a Nessus server and initiate scans and review results right on your smartphone. So the first thing you need to do is browse over to your Nessus server. You can see I've got mine up here using SSL on port 8834. I log in with my credentials that were created for me, or that I created when I went through the installation process. And I jump on over to policies as my first thing. And you can see here that there are 4 policies that come with Nessus right now by default from the Tenable Policy Distribution Service. And they allow you to do external network scans, internal network scans, prepare for PCI audits, and web application testing. And we'll cover various aspects of those policies as we go through. You can, of course, add your own policies by clicking the Add button up at the top. And we'll go through that in more detail as well. So once you've either selected a policy that you want to use or created your own policy, you'd come over to Scans. And in the Scans tab, we're able to add a new scan. And there's a few different options when you do add a new scan. There are a few different types. You can run it now. You can do scheduled or templated. We'll talk about those more as well. So you configure your scan to run. You launch your scan, and then once your scan is launched, you get some reports. And you can see there's all different reports in here. Clicking on one of these reports allows you to view the details. So that's a basic overview of the kind of the workflow, getting Nessus up and running, logging in, creating policies, creating a scan, and viewing the reports. And we'll go ahead and look at those in a lot more detail using various templates as examples. Let's take a look at how to perform an OS identification scan and do some port scanning on our network as well. This is what we typically refer to as an OS identification scan, or I've been calling it lately an asset discovery scan. So you're not going to tell Nessus to necessarily go out and find vulnerabilities, but one of the foundations to discovering vulnerabilities on your network is first knowing which systems exist, 2, knowing which ports are open and which listening services are available on those systems. And then 3, maybe from that and performing additional tests, determine which operating system the remote target is running. all of that is critical in discovering which vulnerabilities are on the system. Also, this information can be useful to you as an administrator to know what's connected to your network so you can run one of these scans on a regular basis as well, so that it's constantly auditing your network and seeing what's attached to your network. So I've created a custom policy called, make sure I'm in policies here, and I've called it OS identification is the name of the policy here. I gave it a policy name. I've checked off the port scanners here. The default is to use the SYN scan. If you're going up against a lot of firewalled hosts or hosts behind a firewall, the TCP scanner has a little bit more intelligence built into it and self-tuning features that can help deal with hosts that are behind a firewall. So we'll leave all of those settings by default in the first configuration screen. We're not going to change anything there. We're not going to enter any credentials. The plugin selection is going to be very specific here. So I'm going to filter for OS identification. And in this, what Nessus is doing here is all of the 40,000 plus plugins that are available to you as a Nessus user are available in this little interface, and you can search them and filter currently by name and ID. So I can go over and you'll see that the general category, by showing a little pie chart here and only a portion of the pie is highlighted, shows me that plugins within this family do contain the string OS identification. And it turns out searching for this is all you need to determine which plugins are enabled. I actually forgot to enable a couple of plugins here. That's actually good to show you how you can enable plugins by just clicking the circle, and when it turns green, that means that plugin is in fact enabled. So all of the OS identification plugins are enabled in this policy. I did change one thing in preferences. When you go to the last preferences tab here, you'll see this drop down menu, and these are all of the more advanced settings within Nessus to further tune your scan. And I usually come down to ping the remote host when I want to run one of these discovery scans. And all I do is I check this box right here that's not checked by default, which says log live hosts in the report. And what that means is if a host only responded to a ping and nothing else, it'll put it in the report. Now by default, Nessus doesn't list those hosts in the report. So when you do more in-depth scanning, or if you're scanning a really large network and you don't care that, hey, Nessus discovered a host and couldn't do anything else with it, then you wouldn't check that box. But here I'm saying show everything that you know about in the report as well. So we'll click submit, and you can see I went back to scans and I created an asset discovery scan. So I clicked add and entered a name for that. Actually, let's edit the one that I have on there. The asset discovery scan. I told it that this was a policy template that I was going to use over and over again. That the policy I'd chosen is the one that we created, OS identification, and to scan those targets. Let me just cover the different types here. So when you create a new scan, I clicked add there, you can run it now, you can schedule it, or you can create it as a template. So run it now, of course, means run it immediately, and then it won't show up in your scans list again. If you make it a template, it will always show up on your scans list, so you can go back and run it again. If you run it as scheduled, you can set a schedule, and you see this little edit button shows up here. You can click edit and tell Nessus how often you want to run the scan. Is it just once? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, yearly? And set the dates within this configuration screen. So you can schedule scans within the Nessus Professional feed. So let's go back, and also you can schedule scans with the home feed as well. So let's go back here, and we've run our scan. And then once you've, actually I should run it for you again so you can see it run. So I click launch and you can see it run. And you can interact with it while it's running and see hosts as they are discovered and get a quick overview of how the scan is doing. Once the report has completed, you can see if one is running here and one is already completed. If I look at the completed report, it brings up the little reporting mechanism that we have going on here. And I can see all of the hosts that it discovered, and I can take a look at the operating system. So if I click on this host and I go to the general and I look at the results from the OS identification plugins, you can see that Nessus identified this host as running Debian. and gives a confidence level and describes the method in which it discovered the operating system. So that's a little quick overview of how we can perform OS identification and port scanning using Nessus to do asset discovery. Let's take a look now at how to perform a basic vulnerability scan, a network-based vulnerability scan. We'll actually go ahead, we'll create a new policy here, and we'll say full network vulnerability scan. I can, since we're going to do a full scan, I can actually change my port scanner out, do the TCP scanner if I'm concerned about going up against firewalls. I can also, sometimes when I do a full scan and I really want to know what's happening on the network, I change the default range and I say, hey, include all ports, 65,535 ports. Include all of those in there as well. And I typically don't change the scan settings. I think safe checks is a good thing to do when you're scanning a full network, because you might not know what's out there, as to not disrupt any services. I like to check safe checks there. That causes plugins to act more safely. We're not going to do credentials just yet. Now for plugins, when I come down here, I make sure all of them are enabled. They're all green. I want to enable all plugins, and Nessus will be smart about which plugins need to run in handling the dependencies. There's a couple of things you can change with respect to running a full network scan. You can go into global variable settings, which is right here. A lot of times I like to enable CGI scanning depending on what I'm scanning. Now if I'm scanning a large internal network, it might take longer if I'm scanning every website with all of the CGI plugins. So this basically causes Nessus to do a more in-depth check of web servers that are out there. Of course, if you really want to be thorough, you can enable thorough test, which causes plugins to basically try harder. Again, this depends on the size of the network that you're scanning. I'll leave thorough test unchecked for this particular one, but I'll go ahead and I'll check enable CGI scanning, just to give you an example of some of the options that are available within Nessus. So then I can come back here, and I've already got a full network scan policy template created. I can actually edit that and just change out my policy to the one that I just created. See this one here, full network vulnerability scan? I can change that out. All that does is tell this scan policy to use a different policy inside of Nessus. I can click Save Template. I can click Launch. And that's going to perform a full scan of my network. I have some results here from a previous scan. See this one, full network scan, was completed a little while ago. And you come down here and you can see the results. You can sort these results by criticality. So you can start with the most severe ones up at the top. And I can drill down into each one of these hosts and see what each one was vulnerable to. You can see here, you can see I've got a vulnerability on port 445. I can drill further down into that particular port on this particular host. And Nessus will load the vulnerability details, and you can see that I've got an open network share, for example, on this particular host as well. We've got a bunch of low vulnerabilities, informational vulnerabilities. If I click on those, I can scroll through the ones here at the bottom. So that's how you do a network vulnerability scan, and a little bit about how you use some of the reporting features within Nessus. Okay, let's take a look at how we do some patch auditing or run the Nessus vulnerability scanner using credentials and just allowing the plugins that require credentials to run. I like doing this because you get operating system level patch information, you get third-party application patching information, and you get plugins that run that do, well, I like to group them in a category called dynamite plugins. They do some really cool stuff, like give you a USB device history off of the Windows system, or tell you if there's a modem plugged into that particular system. So to configure that policy, it's pretty easy. In fact, we can go right back into our full network vulnerability scan, and let's say we want to run this policy now with credentials. You pop over to the credentials tab. If we're talking about Windows systems, you enter an SMB account and an SMB password. Now, if you're running in a domain, this can be a domain account. If you've got multiple accounts that have credentials on your system, you can do that as well. I should also mention that it does work with Linux and Unix systems as well via SSH, and we have a very robust set of features here that allow you to enter credentials for the Linux or Unix systems that allow you to log in and do patch auditing as well. Okay, so once you enter your credentials in here, let's say my username is Bob and I have a really weak password, and I click submit. So that's all you need to do to enable this patch auditing. And I want to show you an example of a scan that I ran with credentials on a network that highlighted several different vulnerabilities. And it was a sharp contrast between running a network scan in this environment and then running one with credentials. So you can see we've got lots of vulnerabilities here in all kinds of different applications. So when you enter credentials, they're going to show up primarily on Windows systems on port 445. And we can see here lots of missing Microsoft patches. And if we dig a little deeper, we should be able to see some of the third-party software as well that was missing vulnerabilities in this environment as well. So we may have to pop over to a different host to see that. We can do that pretty easily. Go through here, take a look at another host within the report. You can see lots of missing Microsoft patches again on this particular host. Again, gathered using the just by entering the credentials. That's all I did, and using you can see here Internet Explorer as well, and making sure that all of my plugins were enabled as well. And you can see here there's lots of vulnerabilities to choose from, just by entering the credentials and making sure all of it is enabled. See here you can see some Flex, Adobe Flash Player, out of date as well. So just to show you that it does also include third-party software. So that's how you perform some patch auditing and application level patch checking as well. Sun Java, I'm trying to see if there's some other Dynamite plugins that we can find here. I can of course go to show filters, and I can say show me all plugins whose plugin name contains USB, and now you can see the Microsoft Windows USB device usage report. So this is a history of all of the USB devices that have been plugged into a particular host as well. So there's lots of different Dynamite plugins, more than I have time to go through here, but that's an example of just one of entering credentials into a policy, how you get patch level information, as well as additional information about your endpoints. Now we're going to look at a different type of scan that also requires credentials, but lets you do something a bit different. So this actually logs into your system, looks at the configuration, and then compares it to the settings that you list out in a .audit file. So your next logical question, of course, is where do you get .audit files? And we, of course, make .audit files for all different kinds of benchmarks. For example, if you want to see if your system configuration settings stack up to the CIS benchmarks for that particular system or application, you can do that by using Nessus configuration auditing. So I've logged into the customer support portal. I go to downloads. I go to compliance and audit files. And you can see here I've got CIS audit policies. So I can come down here and I can download any number of CIS audit policies for applications such as Apache, for operating systems such as Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So I'll show you an example of an Apache audit as well. You can also download sensitive content audit policies, which I wanted to highlight. So let's say as part of your PCI audit, you want to see which systems contain credit card numbers. We actually have a configuration auditing policy for that will log into the system, look for files which contain information such as credit card numbers or social security numbers. So you can download these policies. You can click on this, accept the tenable terms of use, and you'll download the policy. Then you can upload that to Nessus and run scans against your systems. So now that we've downloaded some audit policies, we can go into Nessus and we can look at one that I created for Apache CIS audits. So we can edit this policy, come in here, go over to credentials, make sure we have credentials on the host. You can see I've got multiple credentials entered there. Go into preferences. Now here I want to pop in here and I want to go to Unix compliance checks. So anything that runs on Unix or is a Unix or Linux system, you would enter the audit files here. And you can see here I've got an OWASP PHP best practice guide. And again, I've just uploaded that file as you would any other file within Nessus. You choose the file, select the audit file that you downloaded, click upload, and it uploads it into the policy. Now Nessus will log into the system, check the settings based on the audit file that you've specified. I can look at some reports here. I've got an Apache audit from another scan. You can see I scanned this host, and I found problems in the php.ini file, which I was checking for my PHP settings. And you can see here, that the most obvious one, I purposely set safe mode to off, and the check logged into my system, looked at the configuration for PHP-ini and say, hey, you didn't have safe mode set, so it flagged it as a vulnerability. And that's how you do basic configuration auditing with Nessus. Okay, let's take a look at how we do web application scanning within Nessus. I'm going to create a new policy for this, and I'm going to call it Intense Web Application Scanning. Now you may remember before I said unless you go into those global variable settings, like if I go into the preferences, global variable settings, and I click enable CGI scanning, right, that makes some plugins run. So what that actually does is, if when I click enable CGI scanning here in global variable settings, if I come over to plugins and I see these two families, CGI abuses and CGI abuses cross-site scripting, checking that box actually makes these plugins run. You may select them, but Nessus is going to choose not to run them unless you check that box for performance reasons. Like I said before, if you're scanning a large network, you may not want all these plugins to run. So it leaves that up to you. So for a web application scan, we're going to make sure that we select these. So I'll actually go in and disable all, if we skip right to the plugin selection, and I'll enable CGI abuses and CGI abuses cross-site scripting. Which enables all of these plugins that in these families both find vulnerabilities that we already know about. So there's been an advisory release, the details have maybe been published. We wrote a check for it. So if I put in this filtering CGI generic, the CGI generic plugins will do the fuzzing, and you can see there's a whole bunch of them there. CGI generic cross-site scripting. So to be safe, I like to enable both of those. If I get rid of this filter, I like to enable both of those families when doing web application testing, and that's really where your plugin efforts should be focused, is in just those two families, CGI abuses and CGI abuses cross-site scripting. Now, like I said, in global variable settings, I've enabled CGI scanning. You could also enable thorough test, which causes these CGI plugins, to try harder. But the other options you need to be aware of when doing a web application scan is go into web application test settings. Now, to get any of the torture settings to run, you have to click the box enable web application tests. Now, there's lots of options there that control how long the scan will take, how hard it will try, how deep it will go into your web application. Try it with the default values set at your first run, and then you can kind of move on from there. This is the time per CGI application per port is the maximum runtime, so it's not the runtime of your whole scan. And then the combination of arguments and stop at first flaw settings allow you to control how long it takes and how in-depth your scans run. So make sure you go in there, you enable web application tests so those plugins that do fuzzing can run against your applications. The other thing you're going to want to do is configure web mirroring. and go in here and click Follow Dynamic Pages. This will cause Nessus to, when it finds a website, if the website links to other places inside of that website, Nessus will spider the website, bring all that information back, put it in Web Mirror database, and then based on those results, it will do the web application scanning of those devices, of those new ports that it found in applications. So here I'm not really changing much on the first initial screen. I kind of glossed over that as well. You could, if you were looking for just web servers, put 80 and 443. Of course, that's not going to find web servers that are not on those ports. Then in preferences as well, we also support importing cookies. So you can import cookies into your, so if your web application requires cookies, you can import those into your scan policy. That helps with authentication as well. Sometimes the authentication process of an application requires a cookie. The login page, you can also tell Nessus how to log into the application. And you can do this here. You can specify the page in the form that accepts the login, enter in your username and password, and even get fancier because a lot of times what happens is when you're scanning an application, your login may time out, or you may hit a page that forces you to log out, which logs Nessus out of the application. In here you can tell Nessus to go to a specific page like index.php and look for the string log out, and if it finds that, that means that you're still logged into the application. So you can put some regular expressions in there to make sure that you're still logged into the application, and if you are not and you've gotten logged out, then you can have Nessus re-log in, and that's a great way to make sure that you're not getting logged out of your applications. That pretty much covers the web application scanning. Of course, you would go then create a scan policy template for it, and then you'd see some results as well. I've got a couple of example web application scans here. This is a small little sample application that I've been working with and configured it to log into the application. So you can see it found some cross-site scripting vulnerabilities inside of it, and it also found a SQL injection vulnerability. And we can go in and look for that. And it says, hey, Nessus was able to put this string into the web application, and it got back an error message from the database, which means that the SQL commands that were accepted from a parameter were being executed or attempted to be executed by the database. Therefore, this is generic SQL injection. So that's how you configure Nessus to do web application testing. In this segment, we're going to learn about how to do reporting and filtering within the Nessus interface. Now, you see here, let me back up a minute. I went into Reports tab, and I went into this particular policy, which was a credentialed network audit, which has lots of vulnerabilities, which is a good showcase of the filtering and reporting features within Nessus. Now, I can click here to say Show Filters and enter in all different kinds of criteria. From plugin ID to severity to ports. The most simple one here is severity, of course. I can say show me all of the high severity alerts, and it will filter your results within the interface and show you just the high severity results. Now, one of the other things is the exploit exists field. If I check that box, that will only show me, and if I set this back to severity all, the exploit exists will only show me vulnerabilities for which there exists an exploit in the popular exploit frameworks and exploit writing packages for various software. So the three most basic ones being Metasploit, Core Impact, and Immunities Canvas. And Immunity Canvas and Metasploit have companies that write exploits and produce packs for those packages. So, for example, Canvas has the D2 exploit, and Exploit Hub is a recent addition that is writing exploits that work with Metasploit, but are outside the scope of the other frameworks with respects to the exploits they write are unique to the ones that are packaged with those frameworks. So you can say, show me all of the vulnerabilities for which an exploit exists, and it will filter it. And you can see these, medium, low, and high are in there as well. A lot of vulnerabilities that are in there that don't really require someone to write an exploit, but just going somewhere, revealing information is the exploit itself. So then we can take that and we can download some reports. Let's look at a couple of the different reports here. I can do a detailed HTML report by finding. Let's take a look at what that looks like. And Nessus here, of course, is formatting the report and will display the results back to you in HTML. It's processing. It's got a few results within that report to process. So, and this is the report that I really like. If we scroll down here, there's lots of vulnerabilities, which makes this a good example. And we take a look at one of the vulnerabilities. Let's look at one that has multiple hosts. Here we go. Okay, so for this one, for example, this plugin ID 39622 says the cumulative security update of ActiveX kill bits is missing. So if we scroll down, we can see that each of the hosts that is affected by this vulnerability is listed out separately. So each vulnerability is listed in the report, and then the hosts that are vulnerable to them. So you can see here, number of issues, number of hosts here. Each host that's vulnerable to this one, to the particular vulnerability, is listed out in the report. So that's by vulnerability by host is typically how I refer to that report. Just to show you a little more high-level overview, you can do an executive HTML report here. And we'll go back to this window and we'll let Nessus format the report. And this one gives the charts showing the severity in relation to each other, low, medium, high, the plugins, some of the high severity problems listed on each of the hosts as well. So that's your executive level report. So that's just a quick high level overview of how you do some filtering. I want to show one more example in a little more detail on how you can apply a filter to get some interesting results. And I want to show here the plugin name contains antivirus. And what this is going to do is show you the plugins that affect antivirus specifically. Now I could have entered the plugin ID 16193, the antivirus software. Check. If I go here, this plugin logs in and checks the remote version of the software and the DAT file, or the virus information file, associated with the antivirus software installed. So it gives you the number, the version, and the number, release number for the updates that are applied. So this, you can take someone that always says, hey, all of my antivirus software is always up to date. You can run Nessus against it and find discrepancies in their reports. So that's a way to use Nessus filtering. Now, of course, when you click download report here, you can do a detailed report by finding. Click submit. When you report, your filters apply to the reports. A lot of people don't realize that. So you can see 9 hosts had an antivirus software check, and you can list them out in the report, hand that to your desktop or antivirus software administrator, and get those problems remediated. Let's take a look at how to prepare for a PCI DSS audit. Nessus has this capability where you can run a scan in accordance with the PCI DSS guidelines and see how you would fare if you were having a PCI DSS audit performed in your environment. There is a policy template already created for you for doing this. We can pop into it and take a look. We can see some of the differences from the regular internal or external policies. The SYN scanner is turned on, ping host is turned on. We've disabled the port scanners that only run when you have credentials on the systems. Our port scan range is 1 through 65,535 because the PCI DSS standard says that you have to port scan every single port available. So there are some differences here. All plugins are enabled. If I search for PCI, we can look at the ones that are specific to the PCI standard that are also enabled, of course, when you enable all plugins. And if we look in policy compliance, we can see there's all kinds of plugins that are basically looking at the results of your scan and comparing those to the what is acceptable or not in the PCI DSS guidelines, and then giving you some results based off of that comparison. So you'd run this scan like you would any other scan inside your environment. Then we'll take a look at some of the ports. Now, I did one earlier. I called it a PCI network scan. And if we go in here and you go into one of the hosts and you go into the general TCP category here, you'll see some results that are there. You can see it detected that remote access software has been detected. Now, if you pop into your PCI DSS compliance results, it says, well, you probably weren't really, you weren't compliant. You can see here in big bold letters, not compliant with the PCI DSS requirements because, and it lists the reasons why. Because these 5 plugins fired saw medium risk, which therefore makes it not compliant with the PCI DSS requirements. You can key off of this plugin ID here, 33929. So using what we learned in the previous segment, we can say plugin ID equal to 33929. Click apply. Come back in here. Look at the PCI report for our hosts. We can download this report, an HTML report, by finding, and have a report that lets us get ready for PCI testing. And we can hand this off to our administrators and say, look, we're going to have a PCI test. Look at all of the vulnerabilities that are associated with our host that would force us to be, cause us to be not compliant with the PCI DSS requirements. So that's how you do PCI DSS compliance scanning inside of Nessus. Thanks everyone for watching. You can of course get more information about Nessus on our website, www.nessus.org. You can view more details that cover some more of the advanced options and further details of performing specific scans, including video demonstrations of our Security Center product, all on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Tenable Security. You can find all of the videos there organized into playlists. So thanks everyone for watching.